Thank you very much, Mr Acting Deputy President. I too rise to speak on the Marriage Amendment Definitions and Religious Freedoms Bill 2017. But firstly, I must commend my close friend and West Australian Senate colleague, Senator Dean Smith. Dean and I have been friends for over 30 years, and his magnificent speech this morning moved me to tears. And there are no words to describe just how proud I am of him today. I'm proud of Senator Smith's courage, his commitment and also his perseverance, proud of his eloquence and his compassion. We asked Australians to have their say, and by heaven they have. It is now up to us to respect their will and pass this bill this year. This is why I was very proud and honoured to co-sponsor the motion to bring on this bill to start the debate today, the day after the results were known. As Liberals, we cherish and fight to preserve freedoms of parliamentary democracy, the freedoms of thought, worship, speech and association. For me, this debate has always been about preserving and balancing two potentially competing democratic principles: equality and the freedoms of religion and speech. In Australia, there are no more valued principle than equality, than all Australians are equal, but that they must also be treated equally under the law and have an equality of opportunity in all aspects of their life. And that, of course, includes the legal right to marry. Yesterday's results and historic participation rate demonstrates that Australians are also invested in legal equality in marriage. As a Christian, I also believe we must ensure and we continue to cherish and preserve religious freedoms and the freedoms of speech and association. But as Senator Smith observed this morning, they are two different but equally important principles. I believe that this bill provides legal equality for all Australians in relation to marriage, without diminishing existing religious or speech freedoms. But that said, I have and continue to reserve my right to support amendments in this or in any other subsequent bills that strengthen these freedoms, as long as they do not, conversely, restrict the freedoms of others. I also think it is important, noting what those on the other side of this chamber have said, that all of my colleagues in this place have the opportunity to have their say on this issue and also to have the opportunity to move amendments that they believe would strengthen religious protections. But this debate has also caused me to reflect on the role of us in this chamber. And as we know, probably more so in this chamber than in most other places, that in any democracy we always have to balance freedoms, and no freedoms are ever truly free. And therefore it is our responsibility to have robust debate to work out where we and where the community to seize those balances to the infringement of our democratic freedoms. And we do, and almost every bill that we introduce and that we pass in this place, we do trade off in some way individual freedoms for the collective good. And this is one of the most important responsibilities for all of us, and it is something that I addressed in my first speech and I remain very cognisant of. And it is also, I would note, one of the greatest sources of ideological friction and positions on policy in this place. But I think that is a good thing. It is a good thing for Australia and it is a good thing for our democracy. But since becoming a senator, I have regularly observed that this balance should never be achieved through force, through coercion or through community apathy or lack of engagement. And to preserve our democracy and our society, we have to retain ways of hearing things that make us all uncomfortable, and then be able to robustly and respectfully debate the issues. How else can we in this chamber preserve what is of value to those we represent and to our community? Quite often in this place I've reflected somewhat despairingly that I believe as a society sometimes we appear to be in danger of losing this ability to robustly and respectfully debate the issues of the day. But whatever your personal opinions of the survey, that we promised the Australian people we would seek their opinions and attitudes on this, and we have. But whatever you personally think about this, one of the, I think, most unexpected but absolutely wonderful outcomes of this is that it has been demonstrated that if we ask Australians for their opinion on things that they care deeply about, they will have their say, and they will clearly let us know what they want. And I think that is so important for us here in this place for a number of reasons. First of all, that there are still ways of engaging the Australian community on issues that are of importance to them, but also making them feel that their voice counts and they are not as disenfranchised as they may have thought in our democracy. Over the course of my career, I've had the great privilege to work for many Australian and international democratic institutions, and I've often had cause again to reflect on the nature and health of our own democracy. And I've seen all too often, globally, just what others sacrifice, including their lives, to realise and achieve the same democratic rights and responsibilities we have here in Australia and all too often now take for granted. And in fact, not only do many Australians take our democratic rights and responsibilities for granted, they're increasingly ambivalent and disillusioned with the way our democracy runs. So this, one of the many wonderful outcomes of this survey is the fact that this still proves that that is not always the case. And maybe the reason that people are so disillusioned with politics is that as politicians we haven't gone back and asked people for their opinions often enough. And yes, while we are responsible for making those decisions ultimately, finding ways to more regularly engage and really listen to what's important to Australian people, I think is a prospect that I'm relishing, and I'm sure others are in this place, to pursue. So yesterday was a significant victory for our democracy because, as I said, it does demonstrate that people can be reinvested in their democracy and their decision-making processes. And one thing that struck me, particularly over the last 12 months, as I've engaged with a number of younger Australians, bright, articulate, passionate younger Australians, they keep telling me, and I keep hearing them say, "I want to be heard." And I say to them, well, here I am, what would you want to tell me? I'm a senator. And you can almost hear the crickets chirp. And they'll say, but I want to be heard. And I say, well, yes, but what about? So one of the other wonderful things is that this has given the next generation of Australian citizens and voters an opportunity to demonstrate they still do care about issues, but perhaps we just haven't been listening to them in the right ways. And I think this survey, again, has given us an indication, not of having surveys every year, but actually finding new ways of engaging people and giving them a voice. Because if they didn't know what they actually wanted to tell us, well then this has given us a great idea. The level of engagement is something that, again, is a wonderful news story in this. And I think the nearly 80% has defied expectations of even those most optimistic of this proponents of this survey. And the Turnbull government, another thing that I'm very proud of is that I participated in the party room debate 2 years ago, and I heard there was an opportunity for our party to put forward and realise what we've got to here today. And despite the vehement opposition of those opposite to actually not go ahead with a plebiscite or a survey, I hope even the most sceptical of those opposite would at least acknowledge that we were right in going to the people and giving people a say, and that it has resulted in this outcome. I'm particularly proud of this outcome as a Liberal, that as a Liberal National Coalition government, we have been the ones, largely through the efforts and perseverance of Senator Smith's, whose bill we are dealing with here today. But just on the participation, I'd just like to go through some of the figures because I think it is highly significant. 79.5% of all Australians had their say, and this is higher than the British general election turnout, the French presidential election and the Irish referendums, which were 68%, 74% and 60% respectively. This is a triumph. In fact, the highest vote in a national Australian plebiscite before this was the 1917 conscription referendum 100 years ago, where the no case secured 53.8% of the vote. The highest 2PP vote in a federal election was 56.9% in 1966, and the second biggest majority in parliamentary history was secured by John Howard in 1996, with 53.6% of the two-party preferred vote. What this means is that with 62%, the yes case has secured the strongest possible mandate for an issue and for something for us to action on their behalf than any other vote or survey in this nation's history. I also agree with Senator Smith that Australians have not voted for equality before the law, so that equality before the law in other areas can be deliberately or inadvertently stripped away. For many years in this place, we've had numerous debates, both in and outside of this place, on the merits and implications of same-sex marriage. A central pillar of those arguments, both for and against, has been predicting the attitudes of the Australian people. And as we well know, there have been many and varied numbers bandied around in that debate over the years. And while I do agree in principle that under a responsible system of government that we have, ultimately it is our responsibility to make these decisions, I think that the turnout and the response and the definitive numbers that we now have indicate that this was an important exception to that general rule and that Australians have appreciated being asked. And again, to quote Senator Smith, what he said this morning I thought was very profound. He said this: "To those who want and believe in change, and to those who seek to frustrate it, I simply say this: don't underestimate Australia, and don't underestimate the Australian people." And how right you were. He also said, don't underestimate our country's sense of fairness, its sense of decency, and its willingness to be a country for all of us. And of all of the things I think that as a nation we should be very proud of today, it is that point. So what it does demonstrate is that not only does our country live these values, it now votes for them as well. And I'd like to share the words of Winston Churchill, and I think his views on this are quite fitting for this debate. He said this. He said, "The truth is incontrovertible. Malice may attack it, ignorance may deride it, but in the end, there it is." Since the yes and no campaigns commenced in response to the government's postal survey, parliamentarians and indeed all Australians have heard a range of views on what same-sex marriage should look like in this country. We've also had the time to inquire and reflect upon the appropriate way to amend the Marriage Act and related legislation in a way that does respect the will of the Australian people and also acknowledges the concerns of those who support the traditional definitions of marriage. And I know all in this place understand that there is a need to respect those in our society who do hold deep religious beliefs and are unable or contentiously opposed to presiding over same-sex ceremonies because of these beliefs. I commend all of those who participated in the inquiry and to those who drafted the bill. It is a considered and comprehensive response to the issue of same-sex marriage, and it consciously used the Senate Select Committee on the exposure draft of the Marriage Amendment Bill as the basis for the development of this particular bill. And I think it's important to go back and reflect now on what this committee said. It found there was a wide-ranging desire amongst groups both supportive and non-supportive of same-sex marriage to protect religious freedoms in respect to any future legislation. And what we have before us today does represent a bipartisan and sensible way forward on the matter of same-sex marriage, and I believe it does achieve the intent of those who voted yes in this survey. The Senate Select Committee on the exposure draft of the Marriage Amendment Bill, reported in February this year, as I've said, did deliver a consensus report. The committee was chaired by my very considered and well-respected Liberal Senator David Fawcett. And as you know, it included Liberal Senators Senator Smith, James Paterson, Senators Louise Pratt, Kimberley Kitching, and Green Senators Janet Rice and NXT Senator Skye Kokoschke-Moore. The committee did receive over 400 submissions from a wide range of submitters, including leaders of many faiths. Their report identified a broad desire and a willingness from parties to protect religious freedom in respect of marriage in any future same-sex marriage legislation. The consensus nature of that report was the primary focus of debate when the report was tabled in this place. Senator Fawcett remarked that the report was a good example of parliamentarians working well together and identifying those fundamental rights that must be carefully considered, respected and balanced in future same-sex legislation. And again, I reiterate, I look forward to hearing the opinions of all of my colleagues in this place, but I also look forward to hearing their recommended and amendments in committee stage, because I think it is important that we have this robust debate here. And I'm certain throughout that process in the next week, the bipartisanship and the goodwill that has been exhibited so wonderfully across this chamber in this debate will continue. And to be part of that, I could not be prouder. My thanks to the millions of Australians who came out and voted. We have heard you very loudly and clearly, and we will, in this chamber, respect your will. Thank you.